But there's another story you can tell. And actually, there's probably lots of other stories you can tell. This is just the one I chose to tell in the book, which you call A General History of Compression, right? Remember the shoving more clothes into the suitcase model, right? So in the general history of compression, it's a story really about how people build communication technologies and communication systems. Most people who build, make, sell, circulate these things are concerned about efficiency and specifically the relationship of efficiency to perception. So instead of thinking about definition, again, number of pixels on the screen, size of the file, distance between the loudest, quietest sounds, instead of thinking about definition aesthetically, like you want more definition because it will be more beautiful and more like reality despite the limits of our own senses, instead, they understand definition economically, which of course we all do every month when we get our mobile phone bills. So if definition is an economic problem, then what you're trying to do is produce maximal aesthetic experience from minimal data, which is a very different problem than creating immersive experiences for subjects by overwhelming them with data. And so, the model subject of the general history of compression could be your attentive listener, right? The person with their ear glued to the transistor radio, for instance, would be a great example of an attentive subject with a low definition medium. But they could also be imperfect, distracted, mobile, or instrumental in their use of the media technologies. So, because of that, and because I kept getting this like, well, you know, we have all this technology, why do we wind up with lower definition audio with these MP3s? I said, well, actually, to tell this story, I have to tell three histories in sort of cyclic relationship to one another. The first is the standard history you'd expect, a 30-year history, which is where engineers actually start building the technology. And the generic name for MP3s, the technology behind it, is called perceptual coding. So perceptual coding is to MP3 as facial tissue is to Kleenex. So in the 30-year story is basically engineers start building these technologies. The Moving Picture Experts Group, MPEG, MP3 is sort of short for MPEG 1 layer 3. They set the standard, and then MP3s get named and come into general use for sharing and the distribution of audio. So that's one story, and that's an important story. But there's two other stories I tell in the book. The first is, at what point do people have been thinking about perception and technology pretty much forever. I'm sure, you know, if we could go back to ancient Greece and ask people about drums and stuff like that, and horns and fire signals, we could tell a story about perception and technology. But something interesting happened in the 20th century around the time that corporations started having research and development departments, which is they began to think of this much more economically and much more quantitatively. In other words, can we use measurements of perception to actually tweak our devices? And so starting in the 1910s and 1920s, AT&T gets very interested in the human voice and human ears, and in fact, Harvey Fletcher's Speech and Hearing, which was its sort of first really important edition, I think, is 1929. There's an earlier version, but the 29 version is sort of the big deal. It still shapes speech and hearing science, that book. People will still refer back to it. The phone company gets interested in speech and hearing not to produce a higher definition telephone, but to ask a simple question. What's the minimal amount of signal you need down a phone line in order to be able to understand the person on the other end? And this is a question every time you say a postal code into a telephone, right? This is a question that becomes operative as you're trying to know it's S, not F. Okay, so the phone company gets interested in this. They start pouring money into it. And in fact, what we have is the birth of modern psychological acoustics, or psychoacoustics, the study of auditory perception, but also information theory, that school of thought that leads to Claude Shannon and the idea of the bit that I talked about before. And then in the middle of the story, there's a third story, which is when do computers become audio media? Because of course computers are preconditioned for things like MP3s. Why do they start thinking about the gaps and absences of human hearing as something that can be useful. And I tell this story, I call it the domestication of noise, where noise is no longer a threat, but something that's actually made useful in communication systems. And finally, researchers had to develop predictive models of a phenomenon called masking, which is where one sound basically masks another so that you don't hear it. And that's the theory of hearing built into the MP3 is based on this idea of masking as well as several others, and I can illustrate this for you. So that's what I tried to do in the book. Now, I've been talking actually for 20 minutes, so I'm going to stop now. And what I want to do is change this into a conversation where you either give me comments or argue with each other or ask me questions, or you can ask to hear stories about different things in this book. There's some great stuff about dentistry and cats. Those are two different sections of the book, by the way. There's no cat dentistry in the book, as well as a number of other things. And maybe you want to talk about file sharing or definition and involvement or detachment or whatever. So if you have something to write on or with, take it out. I'll give you a second. I want you to write down what you think are the 3 most important questions you could ask of the MP3. What are the 3 most interesting, and important can be anything like geeky, interesting, or like world historically, we have to save humanity important, or I just don't understand this thing important. It could be anything like that. So I just want to take a couple minutes, make up 3 questions, and go. Okay, so now you have to go sit by somebody if you're sitting by yourself. Turn to your neighbor, and each of you theoretically have 3 questions written down. That's 6 questions between the 2 of you. I want you to just take 5 minutes, discuss your questions. So first, just tell each other what your questions are, and then decide which of those you think are the most interesting, and then we're going to discuss those. Go. So the first thing we learned is who needs speakers? We've got ourselves. But it's my show, so we'll come back together now. So let's share some questions. What did people come up with? Brandon. Yeah, that's a great question. When you said whimsical, I thought you were going to say, could you make MP3s for other species? And there's somebody, it's no longer on the internet, but one of Stefan Helmreich's students at MIT actually made an MP3 encoder for lizards. And I would really like to hear that music. Okay, so relationship to age. There's a lot to say about this, and I'll just say some of it now, and then we can talk more. First thing is, this isn't, of course, universally true, but in general, in industrial societies like ours, people's tastes for music get set somewhere in their teens or 20s. And what this means is, once you have that sort of thing going for you, you think all music should sound a certain way. And this is very much tied to the genres of music that come out. So you take something fairly contemporary like dubstep, whether we're talking the fashionable British kind or the unfashionable American kind, both of them are very dependent on digital media where you can produce a lot of bass without, if some of that music, if it was on record, the needle would cut right through the groove. If you're producing rock and roll, you want the drums to sound like they're hitting a 2-inch reel of tape really hard in the recording studio, or the drums just don't sound right. So my colleague Dan Levitin in psychology at McGill, he wrote a book, his most famous book is This Is Your Brain on Music. Dan invited a bunch of undergrads into his lab, this was a few years ago, played them a bunch of different kinds of formats, same song in many different formats, and discovered that university students, a few years ago anyway, thought that the music that sounded best was 128 kilobit per second MP3. Now, if you were, say, a baby boomer and you did that test, probably the music sounded best when it was on record. right? So there's an interesting age thing about sort of the technology you grow up with, and in fact, many ethnomusicologists have talked about the fact that in most musical cultures, people enjoy some kind of distortion. It's not about purity of reproduction. It's about what kind of distortion do you like? Do you like buzzing things on your mbira? Do you like a bunch of glowing tubes inside your guitar amp? Do you like your cassettes dubbed about 50 times before you hear it, and the voices are, the Bollywood voices are like super saturated? You know, I mean, there's many different kinds of distortion. And so generational tastes get fixed historically. And then there's the sort of biological version, right? The idea that normal human hearing is 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz came from a series of tests done largely on New York City school children in the 20s and 30s. And this has two interesting results. One is that basically every living adult is hearing damaged. And I should say this comes from Mara Mills's work. This isn't research I did. The second is that we are constantly sort of chasing after this normal that's completely unattainable, which is like every disability studies scholar ever has pointed that out as well. But it's particularly poignant in hearing, where people who imagine themselves as non-disabled are technically disabled. So finally, I'll just give you an anecdote. I'm visiting, and this is from a new project, not MP3, but it's totally relevant to your question. I'm visiting a audio company in California who designs signal processing for consumer electronics. And the marketing guy goes to the engineering guy and says, I want you to design a button that makes things sound better. And generations of marketing guys have said that to engineering guys in sound companies. Like it's a tradition. So this guy says, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the music sound like it sounded when you were 20. So for adults that like are buying expensive audio equipment, and it is sort of like a middle-aged, middle-class sort of thing in general, although the audiophile culture is not nearly as rich as you'd think it would be, but that's a whole other discussion. So he built this thing that gives you a hearing test and then adjusts the frequency response of the music to make it sound like it would have sounded when you were 20, except it doesn't quite work because it's not like you get your hearing back. And it's also actually not pleasurable. So of course, the first thing I said is, can I try this? Right, and it's software, it's prototype. So I go in, and it was like a Red Hot Chili Peppers song, I think. So I put the headphones on. First thing we do is the hearing test. Raise your hand if you hear the beep, you know, except it's click the mouse. And I'm like, I aced that, my hearing's great. And then he says, okay, are you ready? Starts playing the Red Hot Chili Peppers, sounds like Red Hot Chili Peppers, presses the button. And I can't describe this to you acoustically, but imagine that you're asleep. And then somebody comes into your room, pries your eyes open, and shines like truck headlights in your eyes. That's what it was like. The eyes were so cutting and sharp and whatever. And so maybe it's, to use another metaphor, a food metaphor, maybe it's like monosodium glutamate, like a little bit will go a long way. But it was a really interesting sort of experiment in exactly thinking about age and enjoyment, and how would you get someone who's 50 or 40 or 60 to experience music like they were 20 again. So, great question.